future of AI, global content creation and SEO, probably focusing more on the risks part of it. Um, I'm going to talk a lot about what Katie and Dan have already mentioned. So this is like the third press of the olives, possibly, likely with more jokes and definitely more cynicism, particularly about search engines, but maybe about life in general. When we kind of look at the future of AI, one thing for us as an agency, ICS, is how scared are we on a scale of 1 to a laundry change being required. I'll also try and cover some of the talking points about the wider context driving Bing and Google and the kind of the corporate elements of this as very much an outsider. Try to give a bit of commentary on what Google has been saying and what Google has been doing, again, driven by that cynicism about what search engines are actually telling us and then subsequently doing. Talk a little bit about the moral aspect of this, because Google does use a lot of moral terminology, which I find really bizarre in a business context. A few current applications of generative AI to support content-led SEO. We've had quite a lot of that already from Katie and Dan, so I won't dwell on that too much, but I'll give a flavor of things. Likewise, case examples, but probably more focused on the dilemmas to consider and suggested methodology. So that's kind of the gig, really. So in terms of why we ICS might be terrified, well, we do like an inhuman, ludicrous amount of content. I think that 1.5 million is probably lowballing it. That's human content written, edited, translated, that kind of thing. We've got like an enormous number of contract writers, creatives, editors, linguists, all sorts of people around the world. So it's like a huge operation, and pretty much every day, or certainly every like business event we go to, people are saying, "Is this not going to massively change what you do? Is this not like a seismic shift?" And it may well be, but I think some of the points that Dan and Katie raised will hopefully give a bit of rationale for why we're not in that mode yet. It's about how AI can be an assistive technology, not something that replaces the guiding hand of human experts. And for us, human expertise is so key, typically, possibly because of masochistic tendencies, work in really, really highly competitive, highly regulated sectors, again, at pretty mad scale in many languages concurrently. If the implications for an AI hallucination getting something wrong can put a client of ours in legal jeopardy, it can immediately switch off a science-minded buyer who knows the exact terminology used in an engineering company, for example. Any little errors there can have a really big impact on uh, SEO performance, but also use value in terms of engaging a relevant audience. So I would say we're not terrified, but we are monitoring the situation closely. In terms of the major platforms themselves, again, this has been covered a little bit already, so I kind of want to dwell or linger on the business aspect of this as an outsider. I don't know if it's a kind of Betamax kind of analogy or a Blu-ray versus HD DVD kind of scenario, but it definitely feels like these platforms are in a fight at the moment. And I think if that's the case, they're not necessarily going to be focused on the best outcome for the users or for businesses. It'll be self-interest being a big part of this. So we've already talked a bit about ChatGPT and Bard, two of the main kind of chatbot type platforms. Like broadly, it feels like ChatGPT is ahead of the game and better at creating actual creation of text, summarizing information in a sensible way. The example previously of ChatGPT 3 versus ChatGPT 4, you can see the level of sophistication now. Arguably, Bard is a bit better, more snackable information, information retrieval. It's kind of what Google has been built for in a way. It sort of leans into a lot of Google trends in general, surfacing data directly on the search engine results page and getting you to that answer quicker, no matter where that answer comes from. In both cases, they emphasize the huge amount of R&D that have been driving this for many, many years, the inhuman amounts of money that's going into this. And again, being my cynical self, I do think the business aspect of this will shape what search engines do, how they evaluate AI content, what they do if it is detectable, which long form content typically is at the moment for many reasons. I think it is worth dwelling a little bit on not just what they say is best practice now, but also what is the objective use value given this wider context. This future conversation is ongoing. It's something that it's hard to anticipate because I think a lot of these decisions around product and rankings and everything else is based on some quite selfish considerations. I think we're quite a long way away from Google's do no evil type stuff. I think Google and other, you know, big businesses like that love money more than anything in the entire world. We've got to be prepared for that. So I don't think it's going to be meritocracy. And I don't think major players tell the whole truth, or even I don't think they're even obligated to beyond their kind of fiduciary kind of responsibility. Google in particular, I would say, is opposed to the fundamentals of SEO. For a long time, they didn't even mention it. Now they sort of mention it in the context of, yeah, do really good content for human beings. Don't try and rank whatever you do, but just do content for human beings. And I'll get to a couple of examples of that shortly as well. Worth probably dwelling a little bit on what might happen with Project Magi or Magi. I'm really unsure of the pronunciation. So this is kind of the search interface that Google is putting together, which will hopefully result in more visibility for content created by real people and businesses, so you can benefit from those rankings. But it's still in question about what will this actually mean for the real estate you take up on the page. It could well be that if answers are, going beyond current rich snippets and kind of highlighted sections where the answers are directly given presently, it might well be even worse where you're getting aggregate AI content formulating an answer on the hoof based on your, content that you've slaved over. So this is where websites will have to be probably even more agile with their content strategy, consider how their content is being sucked up by these type of platforms and what they can do about it. If it is the case, as is rumored, that a third of screen coverage will be taken up, it means that that battle for the top positions becomes even fiercer. You need to be considering probably what clusters of core keywords do you want to pursue, which are the most important ones. And again, that is a temptation with AI content to just try and do everything, which with implications for dilution of relevance and so on. We've already kind of covered with Dan and Katie the freshness aspect of this. That's that lovely reassuring spike. But then search engines are not loyal, and they shouldn't be loyal really. They're always looking to see, is there a better answer? So maintaining that content is going to be even more burdensome. And about how you can build that authority into your site. So Dan mentioned quite a few different ways there around authorship and so on. The offsite dimension is something that agencies typically don't talk about that much because it's comparatively unfashionable. So in that, we're talking about, yes, earned citations and links, when people are covering your site and linking to you because you've got such good content. But there's also, probably half a dozen other methodologies for offsite SEO that are probably not going to have you at risk of a penalty, but will actually allow you to be more muscular in highly competitive sectors. And this is something that frustratingly I can talk partially about, but not fully about, due to the nature of our client base who do work, like I said, at enormous scale. So we have the data sets to see how this works in different countries in very hard fought niches, but we don't necessarily have the ability to give full case studies on this type of stuff. But for people focused on more product based SEO, it doesn't feel like AI yet has become that disruptive because it can be more similar to how SEO was done in the past. So again, Dan's example of nutrition bars, Google and other search engines can spot the difference between, a more detailed listing and a less detailed listing. It might assume that more detail is better, or it might assume that because information is mentioned, that information must be important by virtue of it being mentioned. So it can get a bit circuitous. But even so, if there are implications for how the search engine results pages are structured, that can still have an impact on product and more kind of specific service-based companies. I think it's worth mentioning that, a lot of what we're talking about now is part of a wider trend, not least because of, search engines have been pushing towards a lot of this stuff for a long time about content quality and EAT and so on. If you look at the full calendar year of 2022, it looks like there's over 10 updates, mostly focused on that kind of amorphous term quality. It's very hard to, be very specific about what do you mean by quality, given, different thresholds in different sectors. what different audiences want from their content and so on. As far as I'm aware, there's only one link spam update in 2022. That could indicate that Google just has given up on that side of things, or it feels better able to police content. The party line is right for people, and then your links, your rankings, the traffic will follow. Don't think about it too much. Just do the best you can. Let us sort it out. And any brand mentioned not acquired naturally is seen as spam that puts your site at risk. So this gets us into the moral aspect of generative AI content, and I guess the fundamentals of SEO in general, which Google has really weird moral terminology about. So sites that focus on providing the best content experience for people and uphold the spirit of our principles. Jesus, the principles of a multi-billion-dollar company are more likely to do well in search results. I think that's very debatable. I think that's, you know, I think there's evidence to the contrary there. So I think with that type of moral terminology and that type of statement getting put out there, it's worth thinking and experimenting with what might work, what might not work. So looking at all the kind of traffic graphs, examples from within your industry, outside of your industry, that's something I would definitely look at and see what can you do in terms of spot the difference. And sometimes the limits are political and economic rather than technical or value-based. So the bank rate example, Katie mentioned at the start and Dan mentioned, they've tailed off on that AI approach due to the scrutiny that they're getting about it rather than the SEO results, which is quite intriguing. I think, things like ChatGPT, they do have the potential to ramp up content production massively. Certainly more assistive elements, in your day-to-day work, like developing content briefs, code snippets, and so on. That's very, very useful. Long form text is still easily detectable as far as we can tell because of some of the things we've already discussed. The certain tropes, how certain platforms have been trained, repetition, and that kind of thing. Google has a business incentive not to actively, that's a very peculiar phrasing on my part, not to actively reward detectable AI content from outside its channels. So can we see that Google is a neutral party? We've seen an example this week of the potentially massive fines they're going to get because of YouTube advertising in places where advertisers wouldn't have expected, in formats that they didn't agree to, things like this. I think the nature of the business element of all of this. So it's worth monitoring that as well, not just what these platforms say, but what they do and how that shifts in line with the pressures that they themselves are under. So what does Google have to say about some of this stuff? And again, this is where it comes to the third press of the olives again. I believe that this quote has already been pulled out on the quality. It's on the quality of content rather than how content is produced. This has helped us deliver reliable, high quality results to users. Well, that sounds reasonable enough. Perfect. However, they also say using automation, including AI, to generate content with the primary purpose of manipulating rankings in search results is a violation of our spam policies. Again, it feels very moral to me. Like, what are we doing SEO for if not to try and be number one? It's not like you're opening a door and you're letting your competitor in first because you objectively think that their company is better, their product is better. No, we're trying to deliver certain economic results here. It's not necessarily about saying anything false or trying to push at a closed door. But the purpose of SEO and content is to perform on a business level. So it is kind of peculiar where they say with one thing, oh yeah, we don't really mind how you do this stuff, but also bear in mind spam and we feel that you are a manipulator. So Google does give some useful insights and resources. It's definitely, I think, more than ever, they kind of publish stuff and give some of the rationale. I personally don't like paying attention to their search liaisons, apart from for amusement. I just think there's limits to what they can say, and I think sometimes they're deliberately obtuse. And I think a lot of things, a lot of the best practice does make sense just from a user perspective. Having a fast, user-friendly site, citing your sources, having authoritative authors, marking up the code in a very accessible way, all of that type of stuff, page experience. So you shouldn't disregard official or unofficial sources of info about Google ranking factors, but measure and manage with a pragmatic approach to weighing up business risk. But also interrogate people like me who have a horse in the race. Again, like I said, we work with millions of words of human generated content each month. We have a horse in the race. And other people participating in this event also have their own kind of backgrounds and ways of working that might guide what we say to you. So rattling through the rest of this, because this has kind of been covered already. What are the good applications of AI currently? So definitely, if you're working at scale or looking for inspiration, ideation, headlines, hooks, angles, iteration, so giving multiple options, synonyms, alternatives, food for thought, even for training internally or your own knowledge, asking ChatGPT to simplify a topic for you to support learning. I think that's a great way of doing it. Repetitive tasks like meta description, schema markup, all that kind of stuff, really important. And this is a labor-saving approach as well. And then you might want to also use it to have more multi-channel content, so reconfigure existing content for different formats, like social, like offline print material, perhaps, where rankings are less of a concern. The common factor of these elements here is they're not examples of prime time customer-facing content. Ways to help you perform more efficiently without losing human expertise and judgment. Everyone loves the kind of visual fails of AI, but it's getting better. It's like a year from now, it's going to be like inhumanly good. But the uncanny valley effect is real. We've all seen kind of examples where people have like 12 fingers and so on, which I advise is not normal. But for PR campaigns, there's definitely ways to do things that are more imaginative, more fantastical. But then again, as you've seen with Katie's pillow example, something like a cat curled up asleep on the couch can confuse the AI. So you end up with that kind of monstrosity on the right. But looks like a happy monstrosity, which is how I define myself as well. So with limited time remaining, there's certain things to consider on a more practical basis. So you need to think about the value of work and how potential overuse of AI can result in like a lack of knowledge, a lack of rigor. I think that's definitely something that agencies need to get to grips with and not lose out on staff development, not lose out on developing real experts through exposure, through doing the miles. I think that's a really big issue. Prejudice and bias, these things are not obliged to not be biased. I'm sure these platforms are keen not to have anything overtly horrific out there, but there is not certain normative loading of AI content as there can be of media content. The difference is the scale and potential weaponization here. The risk of content bloat is huge. Just because something's easy doesn't mean you should do it. You can end up really diluting the topical relevance of your site and doing stuff for the sake of stuff. I've talked already about the accountability side, so moral, regulatory, and legal concerns if you get something wrong. Really dangerous is plausible but poor quality output. So something that looks right but actually isn't, and people can load up sites full of that stuff that might even pass an editing check because the editor isn't a specialist, but it can still cause you problems later on. And then you've got all these issues about transparency, differentiation, if everyone's doing, and then the echo chamber theory. What happens when AI is fed by previous AI content ad infinitum? And I think there's already examples of that, particularly with quite salesy or commercial content, where you have really bad prompts en masse leading to not great suggestions. In 7 seconds, do I sum this up? I'm not sure I can do that, but hopefully some of the frameworks I mentioned do make sense in terms of some of the critical view to bring to this, the nature of AI in terms of the business context, and then what you can do to kind of hedge against some of these risks while also taking advantage of some of the labor-saving elements of it as well. But yeah, I think good to be cynical about search engines, focus on what works, and be mindful of who has a horse in the race and why, like what's driving them. So yeah, that's it for me. I'm happy to answer any and all questions, give beard care tips, all that stuff.
Brilliant. Thank you, Martin. Thank you for leaving some time there for questions as well. Loving the question of Google's morals. Here's a quick question for you. What are some examples of EEAT in practice, and how does this relate back to what AI content can currently do?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good one. So this is something that Katie touched on as well. I think it's also where Google can have a mismatch between what it says and what it does. So Google says, it doesn't really matter how this content is generated as long as it shows expertise, experience, authority, and trust. But then you've got to question how can a aggregate AI tool demonstrate that, especially if it's not giving a personal perspective, but an average of pre-existing material. So I think in those cases, you still need to have the guiding hand of a human being. I do think the Bankrate example is a pretty good one, but we don't really know to what extent that type of content was edited and really rigorously gone over from an AAT perspective. It's definitely you definitely need to do more than just attach some person's name to the top of an article. I mean, as Dan says, platforms know, search engines know writing style now. So if you're just kind of what's it called, astroturfing that, it's not going to work. It's going to be more time rather when you could just do the thing right to begin with. And there are still ways to have literal high quality content written by human beings at speed, at scale, that don't open you up to that level of risk. But I think there's definitely ways to mix and match. So for EAT, you can still use generative AI to help you find sources, help you to structure the content in such a way that you're including references, all that type of stuff. You can get it to challenge you to be more persuasive and more data driven to give that authority element. So yeah, I would treat it as an assistive thing, but avoid astroturfing, if that makes sense.
Cool. Martin, do you want to stop sharing your screen? Then we can see you as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Sorry, that's my fault. I should remind you. I've just got another question come through from Sujata. How high is the risk of plagiarism?
So plagiarism with human beings and with AI is a slightly different thing. So for example, again, like I said at the start, we work with thousands of writers. And if we detect AI and it's supposed to be content they've written themselves, we'll cut them off. Like this is really, really important for us. If we are looking to get human expert content, we expect human expert content. Um, so as with AI, it's not if it is generative, it's not necessarily plagiarizing in the sense of doing something word for word. But what you can end up with is that dumbification, you know, and the right answer might be the answer that 1 out of 10 people give. If you're just copying what else is out there in some kind of aggregate format without a personal perspective, without the human factor of humor or authoritativeness or, you know, determination, these other elements of content when you're creating persuasive and engaging content, the risk is not necessarily plagiarism, but just something very average that will not be differentiated. So then you're just doing stuff for the sake of stuff. Plagiarism in the world of human content is still a huge thing. So that's where having proper editorial controls is really important. But you've got to like this content has to perform. It's got to have a function, and that's kind of what we try and do. Like in any language, so we work in about 100 languages. We police that enormous scale because the content has to perform. It's not there just to take up space.